They do not make American generals like Smedley Butler anymore. At the time of his death in 1940, the most decorated Marine in U.S. history, after retiring, wrote the book called War is a Racket. As far as the Mexican president surviving and being able to implement change, he should remember the serious joke from the former Ecuadorian president Correa. Why will there never be a coup d'etat in the United States? Because it doesn't have an American embassy. This joke got repeated when Correa discovered Ecuadorian high-ranking military and police officers were being paid by the U.S. Embassy to spy on the Ecuadorian government and do the bidding of the U.S. The new president of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, has become a puppet of the U.S. After Vice President Pence arranged a $4.2 billion IMF loan for Ecuador, Moreno expelled WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange from Ecuador's embassy in London to face a fate worse than death in the U.S. Past President Correa is now being persecuted for not genuflecting to the U.S. Ecuador is now back in the stable of U.S. banana republics. It is likely that in secret, high-ranking Mexican military and police are being paid by the Trump administration. President Obrador suspects this, and he must periodically genuflect to Trump's demands in order to survive. My support of Obama's policies in the Middle East have been even more disastrous. Obama and I were the principal architects of the overthrow of Libya and the attempted overthrow of Syria, which were dictatorships but each had relatively stable economies and provided free education and health care to their citizens. Our attempts at regime change in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya have caused one of the largest destabilizing mass migrations to Europe and created a very deadly turn in Syria, with the U.S. and Russia launching a proxy war. You know Syria, our friend in the recent past, and the country used for extraordinary renditions on suspects we wanted tortured in the most extreme way by the Assad regime. One infamous case was Maher Arar, a totally innocent Canadian renditioned to Syria at New York's JFK airport and tortured almost to death before we discovered he was totally innocent and a mistaken identity had occurred. The films Rendition and Extraordinary Rendition are based on the case. All of this with the help of one of our favorite dictatorships in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, which has beheaded more of its citizens than ISIS and created one of the worst civilian humanitarian crises in the world in Yemen with our help. Also, the Saudis tortured and killed an American journalist with impunity, and as a courtesy extended by Trump to the Saudi Crown Prince, he refused to condemn it and vetoed the congressional resolution to withdraw our support for the Saudi war in Yemen. Also, the Trump regime never mentions Loujain Al-Hathloul, who was a young woman being tortured and imprisoned for driving before the Crown Prince's decree permitting women to drive. Trump never mentions the beheading of the innocent student destined to an American university because he was part of a pro-democracy protest when he was 14 years old. Our CIA was involved in the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabian torture of captured Yemenis. Our attempts at regime change have been a terrorist-creating machine. All the young men displaced by the bombings and our torture of their relatives are ripe pickings for ISIS and other similar groups. It should be mentioned that Trump vetoed a rare bipartisan bill that would have stopped military aid to Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen due to the Saudis' torture and murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi on Turkish soil. Jamal Khashoggi. The North Korean dictatorship points to the chaos and hardship the U.S. has caused in the Middle East through attempted regime change as what will happen to North Korea if its citizens do not sacrifice so North Korea can nuclear arm itself. American consumption of other nations' goods gives our government great leverage, allowing us to push our allies around. Progressive Americans ask me why countries like Germany continue to support the U.S., given the Middle Eastern refugee crisis adversely affects them, which we have largely caused by our regime change policies. Look at our trade deficit with Germany, Canada, Mexico, and Japan to see how we manage their policies. Blocking their exports to the U.S. can be a major problem for their economies. Additionally, our sanctions do the following. If a German company does any business with Iran or Venezuela, for instance, we block them from doing business with American companies. Why is it that we continue to support so many harsh dictatorships across the globe, some which we then attempt to overthrow when they become too independent of our marching orders? In modern times, this can partly be attributed to Henry Kissinger's influence on both Republican and Democratic administrations, specifically his views and influence on power and keeping the dollar the dominant currency, and keeping America flush in essential raw materials it does not produce enough of domestically. An essential element of this policy involves attempting to limit other superpowers by keeping Russian and Chinese influence in check. To Kissinger, the now Secretary of State, Pompeo, and former National Security Advisor Bolton, the cost in human misery is justified if it keeps America globally dominant.